Now, turning to the next item of business, we have consideration of Business Motion 21593 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau on referral of SSIs. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion? Thank you very much. And no member has asked to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 21593 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. And the next item is a statement by Michael Russell on coronavirus legislation update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak button. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to update the Chamber today on legislation and related matters to do with coronavirus. Last Friday, I gave evidence to the first meeting of the new COVID-19 Committee. The committee will play a key role in ensuring that the legislative powers which have been granted to the government in response to COVID-19 and to the unprecedented circumstances in which we all currently find ourselves are properly scrutinised. The Scottish Government welcomes this scrutiny, and my ministerial colleagues and I are committed to engaging with the committee. This afternoon, I'd like to update the Chamber on four main strands of legislative and related activity. Firstly, the management of the overall legislative programme. Secondly, the development and management of further potential COVID bills. Thirdly, the oversight of the public health regulations, the so-called lockdown regulations. And finally, the coordination of reporting on the implementation of COVID legislation and regulations. Presiding Officer, the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans' statement to Parliament on the 1st of April set out the Scottish Government's approach to management of the legislative programme during this difficult period. As I indicated to the committee on Friday, this not only supersedes any plans previously published, but also confirms Mr Day's intention to keep the programme under constant review. The priority is to ensure the passage of essential legislation, COVID and non-COVID. But we should note that the resources necessary to do that, given the demands of the current situation, are likely to be under considerable pressure and would be further and very perilously stretched if the UK Government does not seek an extension to the Brexit timetable. With these caveats in mind, let me turn to the need for further COVID primary legislation. Such legislation here at Westminster and in the other devolved parliaments is about addressing the disruption to national life and the public services and public sector that dealing with the virus is causing. Of course, the priority is to save lives, and all of us will be more than aware of the individual and collective tragedies that have been and are being played out every day, as well as the individual and collective heroism displayed by our frontline services. The measures we are able to take legislatively to support our fellow citizens are temporary. They're about getting us through this current situation to the time when we can undertake renewal of our country and ourselves. How we do that, in fact, how we collectively choose to do that, was a subject of the framework that the First Minister published last Thursday, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. But for now, we need to continue to temporarily alter our laws and regulations so that we can operate during this period as effectively, efficiently and supportively as we can. The UK bill and the first Scottish bill were immediate reactions. The second Scottish bill I now intend to bring forward includes similar issues, but also items that are required to overcome some problems with statutory deadlines which cannot now be met, as well as items that reflect that the disruption caused by the pandemic will be with us for some time yet. I've asked the opposition parties for details of what they might want to see in the bill, and I hope to give them more granular details of content later this week. But let me indicate just some of the issues I already know will be covered. Registered social landlords will be given more time to lodge their accounts with the Scottish Housing Regulator. The timetable for holding the Citizens' Assembly on climate change will be relaxed, although I can assure Parliament, and especially the Green Party, who were responsible for this amendment to the Climate Change Act, that this will not diminish our commitment to this project. Reflecting the realities of our housing market, for those who had paid the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Additional Dwelling Supplement prior to a particular date, the bill will extend the time period during which a previous main residence must be sold in order for them to claim a repayment from Revenue Scotland. The bill will remove requirements to serve or intimate documents on the walls of court. And the bill will also amend the UEFA European Championship Act 2020 to reflect the postponement of the Euro 2020 Championships to 2021. Presiding Officer, in addition to the Scottish bills and the UK bill, there are also an increasing number of SSIs being prepared by Scottish ministers which are part of the legislative response to the coronavirus outbreak. These are in train and will be subject to scrutiny by the committees as appropriate. All these are technical, but they're also a necessary part of our national response. We will try our very best to ensure that they are also consensual, and I commit myself to continued cross-party working in that regard. Presiding Officer, let me now turn to the lockdown regulations. As members will be aware, the First Minister announced the outcome of the first review of the regulations on the 16th of April, and the Scottish Government made amending regulations on the 21st of April. The next 3-week review period for these regulations ends on the 7th of May. Last week, the First Minister published a paper that set out the criteria, the factors and the framework on which future decisions might be based, and this is clearly a key focus for the Government now. The document was intended to start, and has started, a conversation not just about the current issues, but also about what we will have learnt about ourselves during this time, and how we will apply that to the future of our communities, our society, and our nation, as good neighbours on these islands, as upholders of the values we share with our European friends, and as global citizens. The Bible reminds us there is a time for everything, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. It is not yet the time for renewal, but it is the time to think about renewal. And though it is time to start to talk about how we might move on from lockdown, it is not yet the time, absolutely not yet the time, to relax for a second our vigilance and our vital obligation to stay at home, protect the NHS, and by so doing save lives. I want to emphasise that last point particularly. There is still a very high level of observance of the lockdown regulations. I took part in a conference call with the other governments of the UK yesterday, which touched on that subject. And it's clear that there remains very strong public support for what is being done. The police are working with diligence, but also with discretion, underlining the 4 E's: engage, explain, encourage, and only thereafter enforce. Of course, there is a temptation to blur the edges of the rules, particularly in better weather. On Saturday, for example, there were 766 compliant dispersals. That is where people were asked and agreed to move on and to change what they were doing. That is compared to an overall total of just over 6,000 between the 28th of March and the 26th of April. We as political leaders need to follow the 4 E's too. We need to engage with our constituents on these issues. We need to explain why it is so essential for these measures to stay in force, and the reason, of course, is simple. We must save lives. We need to encourage continued observance, and of course we need to support the police when enforcement becomes necessary. And we need to go on doing so until we are all confident and have incontrovertible evidence that the virus has been permanently suppressed. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me turn to the issue of reporting. The Scottish Coronavirus Act places the duty on ministers to report to the Scottish Parliament on implementation every 2 months, with the first report due when the first reporting period under the legislation ends on the 31st of May. As members will recall, I have also given a commitment to report to Parliament on actions taken under the UK Act in the same way. And it is my intention to combine both of these into a single report. As I noted in my opening remarks to the committee on Friday, the content of this report and our approach requires careful consideration. When combining the provisions within the LCM and the First Scottish Bill, there are over 40 separate items which will require some measure of reporting. And this is before we also add in the items requiring reporting in the next Scottish Bill. Our aim is, of course, to be as transparent and as helpful to the Parliament and to the people of Scotland as we can. We must be able to demonstrate that where powers are being used, they are being used properly and proportionately to implement measures which we consider to be essential. And also that such powers are not being used if they are no longer needed, and if so, the reason why. Reporting must reflect not only the need to avoid placing undue pressures on those at the heart of our response, but also the fact that the measures within the legislation are of varying degrees of significance in terms of their impacts and the level of interest in their operation. Some measures are of particular and significant interest for members, for example, because of their political impact on vulnerable groups or their implications for particular rights or protected characteristics. Others may emerge as such over time, and our approach must be sufficiently flexible to respond to this. What we are therefore considering is a matrix approach, by which we would prioritise measures of most significance and greatest interest in our reporting, and give most detail on the operation of powers for such measures. The criteria by which we judge significance and impact is a very important question. The particular areas where we wish to direct our focus within the reporting process is germane, and I'm happy to hear views this afternoon on that and other issues. Presiding Officer, on a final point, I'm aware that there are areas of interest where members will wish to seek information on specific decisions or matters relating to implementation or operationalising of measures contained in the legislation. In such cases where this information is requested in advance of the formal report, I will be happy to follow these up with my ministerial colleagues who have portfolio responsibility for the relevant area and are therefore best placed to respond. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I hope this update has been helpful to members. I would underline again the Scottish Government's ongoing commitment to engaging with Parliament and colleagues across the Chamber as we take forward our legislative collective response to COVID-19 over the next month. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I would encourage those members who wish to ask a question and who haven't already done so to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Murdo Fraser to be followed by Alec Rowley. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and for advance sight of it, and thank him also for the open and consensual way he has approached the forthcoming legislation, an approach we have tried on these benches to reciprocate by working in positive fashion, and I intend that approach to continue. Can I firstly echo the comments he made about lockdown? There is a lot of media chatter about how and when lockdown might be eased, and this builds public expectation. On the television news at lunchtime, there were pictures from Australia of the beaches having been reopened, and that has an impact on people here. And it's significant because the lockdown is largely self-policing, and it's important that any relaxation is not only driven by the science, but also it is clearly communicated to the public and to the business community, who we all have to bring along with us. Can I also welcome the proposed legislation giving registered social landlords more time to lodge their accounts, an issue my colleague Graham Simpson had raised, and also the extension to time limits for the additional dwelling supplement, another issue which has been raised with me. We did also raise some other changes that might be considered in this bill, for example, changes to tenancy law to incentivise properties currently being available for short-term lets being brought into use for longer-term tenancies, and also relaxation of the licensing laws to allow the purchase of alcohol by vulnerable groups and NHS staff before 10 o'clock in the morning. Will these items be considered in the context of the forthcoming bill?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Murdo Fraser for his remarks and also for the positive way in which he's approached this, both as a party spokesperson and latterly as the chair of the COVID-19 committee, and I'm grateful for that, and I hope we can continue to take things forward. As I explained in my statement, and I've said to him earlier, the process of selecting and deciding on the final elements in the bill is still ongoing. I would hope by the end of this week to be able to speak to the party's spokespeople whom I'm dealing with on this about the final content of the bill, and I don't want to commit myself to particular items at this stage. Some issues which have been raised by opposition parties and others can be dealt with by regulation or secondary legislation. The legislation is designed for those items that cannot be dealt with in that way, and that's what we will bring to the Chamber. In addition, I hope we can also find agreement on most of the issues. We managed that in the first bill with a couple of exceptions. I'd like to see if we can get those exceptions out of the way. That will require not just me, but also a collaborative view from others. But if we can do, then I would hope we would have within the bill a range of items which are agreed. They can always be improved. I'm often say in this chamber that my attitude to bills is that a bill is not fully finished when it comes to this chamber, and it can be improved by amendment and by discussion. If that is possible, we'll certainly do so. I note the point he makes about licensing. He has raised it with me on a number of occasions. I am still in discussion with colleagues about that, but I do think it is a point that would have support, I know, from a whole range of people.
Alec Rowley to be followed by Ross Greer. Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would want firstly to acknowledge the Cabinet Secretary's engagement with other parties, and I think that's been important and will continue to be important, so we want to acknowledge that. The Cabinet Secretary, where he brings forward and where the case is made for emergency legislation to deal with the COVID crisis, then Labour will support that legislation and Labour will work with the government through this difficult period. Can I return to the framework document? The Cabinet Secretary talks about the framework document, but does he not agree that there needs to be further discussion and debate in this chamber in this Parliament around that framework document, because there are contradictions. If we are to move forward in a safe way, as the First Minister has outlined, to get out of this, then we need to test. The World Health Organisation has said test, test, test. The Health Secretary, indeed, over the weekend doing interviews, talked about test, trace, isolate repeatedly. But where are we actually getting to in terms of testing? And if we're to take the public with us, then there needs to be clarity. There also needs to be clarity around workers. This weekend I've had quite a number of workers get in contact with me to say their employer wants to start back at their work. What rights do they have? What rights of protection do they have? We're certainly protected in here, Presiding Officer, but what rights do workers have who are being told that they've got to go back to their work? So there needs to be a proper discussion and debate in this Parliament around that framework document so that we can all have a better understanding of how we are going to proceed trying to move ourselves forward out of this. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree with that, and would he look to the Government to timetable a debate in this Parliament on COVID over a couple of days so that we can have these discussions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, and I repeat the remarks I made after Murdo Fraser had spoken. I am grateful for the cooperation of Alec Rowley on the discussions we've been able to have about this bill, and we will continue to have. And he raises important points. I can tell him hot off the press that there will be exactly the debate he's seeking on the issue of the framework document, how we move forward, about the suppression of the virus, because that is the issue. The issue is the suppression of virus and what actions we take and continue to take to do so. There will be that debate, I think, 2 weeks today. And I hope that you, in the Bureau, that will be supported by the Labour Party, and that will make it even easier to have that debate. And that would be a debate in which we can look at, as I'm sure this afternoon we will look at, the strategies that are being pursued by the government, the test, trace and isolate strategy. The way in which there is also the need for a wider debate in Scotland about how we move forward together. Some of the issues that Mr Fraser has rightly outlined that have been raised in the press are not issues that any of us would treat seriously in terms of what's going to happen next. But all of our constituents, at least I would expect all of our constituents, are interested in these matters, and it is actually very impressive how interested they are. I note that by 12 o'clock today, 397,000 people have viewed the paper on the Scottish Government's website. That is not a usual reaction to a government document. And that does mean that it is the type of discussion we need to have both in this chamber and outside this chamber, and together then we need a common strategy. But let's see if we can agree that together rather than do it confrontationally.
Ross Greer to be followed by Willie Rennie. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. The Greens acknowledge entirely the need to readjust the timetable for the Climate Citizens' Assembly, but the need for it to take place is now greater than we would have ever imagined. This pandemic is, and it will, cause the greatest global economic collapse of our lifetimes. We will not be tasked with rebuilding the global economy afterwards, but with building one anew. So it's essential that the economic recovery from this health crisis doesn't double down on the systems and approaches which have caused the continuing climate crisis. So can I ask the Scottish Government to confirm that it will use the Climate Citizens' Assembly to help shape the economic recovery required over the coming months and years, providing an essential counterweight to the economic elites who are already lobbying for bailouts from their private islands?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'm glad that Mr Greer has accepted the reasoning behind the postponement. I can assure him that that is a postponement. It is not a refusal to go ahead with it. Rosanna Cunningham was listening to that. I'm sure she will have been influenced by it. I know that she will want to see, well, I'm sure that she will have been influenced by it. Rosanna Cunningham, in my experience, is a generous and open-minded person, and she will undoubtedly have been influenced by it. And she will want to, because she will be the person leading this, she will want to take forward a green recovery in Scotland of exactly the type that I hope Ross Greer is talking about. That will require compromise and debate across the chamber, and who better to lead consensus and debate than Rosanna Cunningham. So I do think that that will be a positive step forward. I'm sure not everybody in the chamber, Presiding Officer, reads my column in the Sunday National, though it would be edifying if they did. I did reflect. Well, it is their loss, not mine, I have to say. But if they did read it, and if Mr Rumbles read it, he would know that this week I started off with an observation about a television clip I saw last week of a jellyfish swimming in a canal, a Venetian canal. And the fact that the environment in its small way I don't know why Mr. Simpson finds a jellyfish and Venice funny together. It's clearly a joke that I don't realise. But the reality is that the environment slowly and not consistently is beginning to heal. Our recovery must make sure that we accelerate that healing and we keep it at the forefront of our minds.
Okay, Willie Rennie to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
The Cabinet Secretary said in his statement, our aim is to be transparent. But tomorrow's meeting of the Scottish Police Authority, which includes a report on the use of the police powers that have just been agreed, is taking place behind closed doors. Parliaments and councils across the country have managed to conduct virtual meetings, so does the Minister wonder why the Scottish Police Authority can't? I see no reference in today's statement to the potential use of the contact tracing phone app, the smartphone app. These issues are about the information it gathers, how it's shared, and what access government would have to the information. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out under what legislative powers would the phone app be used?
Cabinet Secretary.
I have to say, on the matter of the Scottish Police Authority, that is not a matter for me, that is a matter for the Scottish Police Authority, and I'm sure that they will have heard what the member has said. In terms of the smartphone app, I am familiar with the debate that is taking place about how the data should be handled in that app, whether it should be localized data or whether it should be centralized data. Both of those approaches have been approved by the European Commission as legitimate approaches, but both of them present issues in terms of regulation. Now, the Scottish Parliament is not directly responsible for that regulation, but I think the member is right to raise that as an issue that needs to be discussed, and I will take that issue away to see if there are implications for our own legislation and whether we should be considering them. But it is, I believe, a reserved matter, and therefore, although I'm always encouraged when Mr. Rennie wants us to move into reserved matters, it is at least a small start, but I'm just not in the position to give him an assurance of that just now.
Annabel Ewing to be followed by Liam Kerr. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It will remain important, of course, to ensure that despite the short timescales open to us, we do all that we can to get emergency legislation right. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, therefore, what steps the Scottish Government will take to ensure that the forthcoming coronavirus bill can be subject to due scrutiny by the Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is a very good question, and I had this discussion with the COVID committee on Friday, and I'm happy to repeat what I said then, and perhaps I can add a little bit of detail to it. The intention is not to treat this as an emergency bill, but as an expedited bill, a very expedited bill, I have to say, but not in a single day. And at the present moment, we would hope to introduce this bill in such a way that a committee, presumably the COVID committee, but that would be up to the Bureau to allocate it, a committee could consider this at stage one in a single sitting, make a recommendation to Parliament for a stage one debate, which is provisionally set for 3 weeks today in the afternoon, then to be able to take the bill back at stage two the next morning, the Wednesday morning, that would be 3 weeks tomorrow morning, for a stage two session within the committee, and to bring the bill back for stage three that afternoon. And that would be subject to the Bureau, of course, and to final timetabling, but it will mean that the bill would get a longer scrutiny and more varied scrutiny than the original bill had. These are items we require to have on the statute book quickly. We would also wish to see an expedited royal assent in this programme so that the bill was on the statute book before the end of the month. But that does give a better opportunity to debate and discuss it than we had with the first bill.
Liam Kerr to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary talks about the importance of transparency in reporting and speaks of the number of dispersals made by police, both on one day and over 1 month. I think people will be interested to know how that and further enforcement breaks down in terms of matters such as geographical location, numbers taken forward to prosecution, perhaps any repeat presentations. So can you tell us, will detail like that form part of the reporting to Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
I made it clear in my statement that we want to have a proportionate view of reporting. And the matrix I talked about in my statement is about taking the key issues that are dealt with and make sure they are reported on as fully as possible, right through the spectrum to issues which will not have a great deal of detail attached to them. Now, there is very legitimate interest in how these regulations are being enforced. So I can't speak entirely for my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, but it would seem to me this is an area we would want to report on in more detail than some of the other areas. And if we will accept that assurance, then I will hope that the Cabinet Secretary of Justice will flesh that out as we move forward.
Fulton McGregor to be followed by Monica Lennon. Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, President Officer. It's important that essential legislation is prioritised, particularly in relation to coronavirus. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government should seek an extension to the Brexit timetable as a priority to reduce pressures on the legislation process, both here in Scotland and across the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can only say yes. There is not the bandwidth to deal with this at the present moment. And I have to say that if there were added to the present problems, two factors. One would be additional legislation, including primary and secondary legislation arising out of the Brexit process, which is a real possibility. That would be the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the work of this Parliament and this Chamber. And the second issue is economic damage. We know there will be economic damage from the Brexit process. That is even admitted by those who support Brexit. But if you add that to the economic damage that the COVID pandemic will cause, which we also see projected as being immensely severe, and at the same time we're asking companies to change their methods of operation, their activities, I think that is a recipe for even further disaster. There is no question. Virtually everybody I speak to says that there should be a delay. And any assertion, and I know this assertion has been made by the chief negotiator, Mr. Frost, that in some sense businesses are telling him that they want an end to uncertainty. That is simply not what businesses are telling either me, or even his colleagues, or even their trade associations, or even the world at large. That is not what is being said. Businesses want the delay, the pause, and to look at this and to say it cannot happen in the way that Mr. Frost appears to think it should happen.
Monica Lennon to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary made a welcome commitment in his statement today to publish information in advance of the formal report should MSPs request specific details on implementation or operational matters that are in the emergency legislation. He knows that I raised the issue of social work needs assessments at the COVID-19 committee last week, and since that meeting there's been growing concern that people are not receiving care packages and that assessments are not being carried out. So on that note, would the Cabinet Secretary agree that weekly reporting of the number of care assessments that are being carried out should be published, that we do get maximum transparency and to ensure that the needs and rights of older and disabled people are being fully met?
Secretary.
I just want to be clear what I actually did say, that when this information is requested in advance of the formal report, that is not another process of reporting. It is if there's a request for information in advance of the formal report, I'd be happy to follow these up with my ministerial colleagues. So just to be clear what I did say, I don't think there is a case for putting yet another reporting cycle into the tough reporting cycle that is here. But if there are concerns, and the member expressed those concerns at the COVID committee last Friday, if there are concerns, then it is open to any member to seek information. And that is, of course, what a primary job is. And if those questions are asked, then they need to be answered. I think it is important that there's an understanding of how these powers are being used. The member was right to say, I know at the committee that they were enacted, they were brought into use on April the 5th. It is important to know how they are being used, and if there is concern about how they are being used, then it's important that that concern is discussed and the concerns rectified. But I do stress, I really do not think that we should be tying ourselves into schedules of reporting over and above what we have, but where there are concerns, they need to be examined. I accept that, and the member has raised a concern, and therefore if she asks questions, no doubt in the right way, because I'm sure she more than knows how to ask questions in the right way. If she asks those questions in the right way, then they will have to be answered. And well, if you ask a question, then you get an answer. That is what the normal situation is. Well, I have to say, we have set up. We have set up a whole range of ways in which information can be found. Those exist, and I'm happy on this issue, because the member has raised it twice, to support her trying to secure an answer to this if the information is available. You can't conjure information out of nowhere, and if the information isn't available, then there is an issue of proportionality, how much time is going to be spent getting it. But I accept the member's concern. This has to be taken forward, and I have heard it, and I will endeavour to take it forward.
Well, there are, in fact, 9 more questioners, but I don't think we're going to get through anything like that, I'm afraid, in a couple of minutes. Shona Robertson to be followed by Liz Smith. Shona Robertson.
The Scottish Government has been actively working to engage the public about the complex decisions that lie ahead of us as we look beyond lockdown. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the significant number of people accessing the guidance in the framework. So what more can the Scottish Government do to encourage the public to feed into this conversation, to keep them engaged in helping us to ensure that decisions taken have their support and consent?
Cabinet Secretary.
That's a very important question. The First Minister indicated when she published this paper last week, this was an iterative process. This is not the final word by any manner of means. It was the start of the conversation, so I would expect the conversation to grow and develop on both sides. This is not a static situation. Murdo Fraser again referenced the press interest in this. There's a great deal of discussion about what should happen next. So that's feeding into the process. As an individual constituency MSP, I've had quite a number of responses, which I've sent on and it's within the system, and I know we will be saying more shortly about how we would do that, how that information can flow both ways, and it will influence the iterations of this paper and the policy as it develops. But we have to be aware that it must be guided by science, it must be guided by the absolute necessity to suppress this virus now and for the future, and that is the objective. And of course, what is happening must be supported by the public, who must be persuaded of the need to do so.
Liz Smith.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary knows only too well that there are many health risks that are directly affecting this lockdown, not least the risks to mental health. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he can give an assurance to this Parliament that these mental health risks are being fully taken into account as the Scottish Government considers when to ease lockdown?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can. Discussions that I've been involved in recent days have, on every occasion, the issue of mental health has been mentioned, and on every occasion there has been an acceptance that that must be very prominent in our discussions. We all know, having lived through this together as we're living through it together, that we've all felt pressures in the present situation, and we will all want to say that, I'm sure, in different ways. We also know that some people have reacted very adversely to those pressures, and that some people are in considerable distress and illness as a result of those pressures, and everything is being done to help and support them, both on a national and a local way. And I am very impressed by the way in which local resilience groups and other local groups are working to ensure that they are supporting people who sometimes are isolated, sometimes on their own, and sometimes feeling very vulnerable indeed. So it is an excellent point. It is at the heart of our thinking, and we should all recognise that there is nothing, absolutely nothing wrong in us saying to our friends, to our neighbours, to our colleagues, to our workmates, that we are finding it difficult too, because sharing that information is also part of moving forward.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've not made much progress through the questions today, but that's all. Point of order, Mr Kelly. James Kelly.
I seek to raise a point of order, Presiding Officer, in relation to the conduct of this afternoon's business. I have serious concerns that Parliament has been sidelined and we're not been given ample opportunity to discuss the important issues such as the exit from lockdown, testing and the provision of PPE. What's the point in members coming through to Edinburgh for these sessions if we're not able to raise the concerns that people are raising with us in our constituency and region? I would ask, Presiding Officer, that you and the Bureau give serious consideration to looking at the programme to ensure that we have ample time to debate these issues and to represent our constituents fully.
Can I thank Mr Kelly for his point of order? I certainly recognise the frustration Mr Kelly refers to. I think, in fact, Mr Kelly was not able to take him a couple of times recently when he asked the question, and today's another example. I'm afraid the Bureau did agree the allocated time. We've got a couple of other statements as well as First Minister's questions today, and we have allocated a certain amount of time for each of them. Sometimes the question and answers take longer than perhaps we would anticipate. I would suggest it's up to the member through his business manager to propose new business to the Bureau. The Bureau will consider any items for consideration. I would also encourage any members who didn't get in today, and that would include Joan McAlpine, Rona Mackay, Graham Simpson, James Kelly, Neil Findlay and Andy Whiteman, to press their button at a later of the statements today or at First Minister's questions, and It'll be noted that you didn't get in at the earlier question. And on that, we're going to move on to the next item of business. There'll just be a short second while we change chairs.